Hello and welcome to Pro Tips with Studio Pros. Today we're going to tackle 2 key tips to writing bass lines. You could be a great guitar player or keyboard player and still struggle with writing a good bass line. Reason being is that you play the instruments really differently. They occupy a different space in the frequency spectrum and serve different purposes. Whereas the guitars and keyboards occupy the higher frequency ranges for the most part, they can get away with rhythmically doing pretty much whatever they want. Whereas the bass, since it's a lower frequency, it's a little bit more locked into the drums. The first thing we're going to talk about is what notes should you play in a bass line. Well, with guitar or keyboard, you can get away with playing all kinds of notes. You can sustain notes that aren't even in the chord. You can play different notes that are in the chord. But with a bass line, you really want to, for the most part, play the root of the chord. So for example, in an F major chord, the root would be F. In a B flat minor chord, the root would be B flat. The only exception to this rule is if you have an inversion chord or a hybrid chord, in which case you'd want to play the note that is lowest in the chord. So for example, in a C major over E chord, the E would be the note that you'd be playing in the bass. So that's the oversimplified version, and we'll get to a slightly more complex version of that in a second. But the other really important tip in writing bass lines that a lot of guitarists make this mistake when they transition to start to play bass is that you have to be very, very conscious of what the drummer is doing. Unlike guitar where you can just strum away and you can even contrast what the drums are doing, with the bass you have to be very in touch with what the kick drum is doing. Most of the time, it's a really good idea to know what the drummer is doing and follow the kick drum with the bass part. This gives you that really tight together feeling and makes it sound like you're an actual bass player. It can sometimes be cool to contrast what the kick is doing, but you want to at least at first establish that standard sound. But enough talking, let's show an example here. I'm going to use a real bass, but MIDI bass works just as well. Well, not just as well, but close. Okay, so in this first example, I'm just going to play whole notes and follow the chord changes as they come along. So that's fine, that'll work in a bunch of scenarios, but now I'm going to actually follow the exact kick pattern and just play the root, like I said earlier. So now there's a little more excitement in the bass line, but it's still fairly tame. So what can we do to make it a little more exciting? Well, there's 2 other notes in most chords that you'll encounter that work really well as a part of a bass line. And that's the octave above the root and then the 5th above the root. And that's easy to figure out. So for example, we're in the key of E in this song. An octave above E would be, so it's the same note. And then a 5th above E, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just like an octave is 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, quick disclaimer, before I was talking about inversion chords or hybrid chords, for those, a 5th above isn't going to work. You'll have to figure out per that chord what the right note is. But you can see what works for your song when you're actually writing the bass line. Anyway, let's see what it sounds like if we add the octave above as a part of our bass line using the same rhythm we just used. So now there's yet even more movement, a little more excitement, and for different songs it could be appropriate. Let's say we want to add an other note into the mix. Let's add the 5th, see how that sounds. Now we have quite a bit of variety in the part. We're using both the 5th and the octave above the root as part of our bass line, as well as following the kick, so it sounds really stable. Now if you want to add some fanciness to it, just make sure you're using notes from that chord, but you're also keeping in mind the chord that you're going to next. Once you feel comfortable using the root, 5th, and octave as part of your bass lines, you can start to mess around with other things. So remember to listen for the kick pattern, and try to follow it. And then as far as the notes to use mainly the root, and then you can play around with the fifth and the octave. And then once you're really comfortable with that, you can start to introduce other notes from the chord and the key. Or if you're feeling really fancy, even outside of the key. So go ahead, make some music, try it out. If this is all just too much for you, then don't worry about it. Studio Pros has some of the industry's top bass players, and they'd be happy to write a bass line for your song. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like and subscribe below. Leave any comments that you may have on the video. Check out our services at studiopros.com and keep it funky.